You've heard the story wrong all your life. Did Jesus feed just 5,000 and leave others hungry? It's a lie that's been blinding us. But the real story? It starts with a simple question. Did one person really go hungry? Think you know the miracle? You don't know even half of it. And the numbers are bigger, the impact is greater, and the truth? It's more abundant than you ever imagined. What is the gap between what you've been told and the truth? It's vast and shocking. Are you ready to step from shadow into blinding light? The full story awaits, and it's more revolutionary than ever. Ready for your mind to be blown? The sun setting down on the Galilean hillside. Several faces turned expectantly toward Jesus. Thousands had gathered, drawn by his teachings and the promise of miracles. But as the day went on, a problem arose, one that would reveal a truth more profound than anyone could have imagined. Hunger arose in the crowd's stomachs. The disciples, worried, approached Jesus. "Send them away," they urged, "so they can find food in the nearby villages." But Jesus had other plans. "You give them something to eat," he said, his eyes twinkling with a secret only he knew. The disciples were dumbfounded. How could they possibly feed so many? Their meager resources, 5 loaves and 2 fish, seemed inadequate. But Jesus took those humble offerings in his hands, and what happened next would echo through eternity. In the next few minutes, we will explore the untold story behind the feeding of the 5,000, revealing how this miracle goes far beyond simple mathematics. Let's start from the beginning. Why would Jesus lead thousands of people to a remote location without any apparent plan to feed them? Where and for what did so many people gather? This question lingered in the air as the crowd grew restless. They had come seeking spiritual nourishment, but now their physical hunger was becoming impossible to ignore. They had come from towns and villages across the region, some traveling for days. Farmers had left their fields, fishermen their nets, and craftsmen their workshops. They gathered on this remote hillside, far from the bustle of towns and markets, to hear the words of a man who spoke with authority like no other. Some came seeking healing, hoping that a touch from Jesus might cure their problems. Others came out of curiosity, having heard tales of his miracles and teachings. Still others came seeking hope, a ray of light in their often difficult lives. Whatever their reasons, they now found themselves far from home as the day drew to a close. The sun was setting lower in the sky, and hunger was gnawing at the stomachs of the crowd. Children whimpered and adults shifted uneasily, their attention wavering from Jesus' words to the growing discomfort inside their stomachs. But as the day wore on, a problem began to emerge that would set the stage for an unbelievable demonstration of divine power. Think of the dilemma that the disciples would be going through. They were responsible for feeding thousands of hungry people with no food in sight. How did they overcome it? Let's find out. As the disciples looked out over the sea of faces, worry creased their brows. They grouped, whispering urgently. "Master," one of them finally approached Jesus. "The day is nearly over, and we're in the middle of nowhere. Shouldn't we send the people away to find food in the surrounding villages?" The growing crowd and hungry people presented a logical nightmare. Thousands of mouths to feed, and not a market or granary in sight. The disciples' concern was noticeable. They had seen Jesus perform miracles. But this seemed beyond even his capabilities. Jesus, however, remained calm. His eyes twinkled with a secret only he knew. "You give them something to eat," he said, his voice steady and assured. The disciples exchanged confused glances. Philip, ever practical, spoke up. 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. The impossibility of the task weighed heavily on their shoulders. How could they possibly meet such an overwhelming need? Just when it seemed impossible, Jesus was about to reveal a truth that would challenge everything they thought they knew about scarcity and abundance. A glimmer of hope. A boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 tiny fish. But how could this possibly be enough? It's barely a meal for one person, let alone thousands. How could anyone feed thousands with just 5 loaves and 2 fish? Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, brought a boy to Jesus. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish," he said. But how far will they go among so many? The question hung in the air, a mixture of hope and doubt. The disciples were dumbfounded. How could they possibly feed so many? Their meager resources, 5 loaves and 2 fish, seemed woefully inadequate. But Jesus took those humble offerings in his hands, and what happened next would echo through eternity. When Jesus took the bread and fish in his hands, silence fell over the crowd. He looked to heaven, giving thanks for this modest offering. Then he began to break the bread and divide the fish. As he did so, something extraordinary happened. The food multiplied. It didn't just stretch to feed a few more. It multiplied abundantly. The disciples, their eyes wide with shock, found themselves distributing more and more food. Baskets that should have been emptied in moments remained full. The bread didn't run out, the fish didn't diminish. As the disciples moved through the crowd, passing out the ever-multiplying food, looks of wonder spread across faces. People who had been complaining with hunger now ate their fill. Children laughed with delight as they received more than enough. The atmosphere on the hillside transformed from one of anxious anticipation to joyous celebration. The miracle unfolded before their very eyes. Piece after piece of bread, chunks after chunk of fish was distributed. Yet the supply never slowed down. It was as if the more they gave away, the more there was to give. The disciples who had doubted just moments before now found themselves participants in one of the most shocking displays of divine power they had ever witnessed. You've heard about Jesus feeding the 5,000, but there's a hidden detail that changes everything. But before we proceed with the next part of the video, if you are someone who likes such stories and wants to learn more about Christianity, then hit that subscribe button because we post such amazing stories every week. Now, let's get back to our miraculous meal, because things are about to get even more interesting. What if I told you that the most shocking part of this miracle wasn't about how many were fed, but about what was left over? Scripture tells us they all ate and were satisfied. After everyone had eaten their fill, Jesus instructed his disciples to gather up the leftovers. "Let nothing be wasted," he said. The disciples, still in awe of what had happened, began to collect the remaining fragments. And how much remained? 12 full baskets. 12 baskets. The significance of this number wouldn't have been lost on the disciples or the Jewish crowd. 12. The number of tribes of Israel. The number of completeness. This wasn't just about the efficient use of resources. This was Jesus making a profound statement about God's overflowing abundance. From 5 loaves and 2 fish, thousands were fed, and still, there was more left over than they started with. The food seemed to be still multiplying, a wonderful demonstration of God's inexhaustible provision. The disciples stood in between the gathered baskets, their minds struggling to understand the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. But there's still one burning question we haven't addressed. Why did Jesus choose this particular miracle to perform? Of all the ways he could have demonstrated his power, why this elaborate display of multiplication and abundance? This miracle wasn't just about food. It was a living example of the nature of God himself. Through this action, Jesus was revealing God's character in a way that words alone could not convey. But how? Let's figure out. In the Old Testament, God provided manna for the Israelites in the wild. Now, Jesus was showing that he could provide for his people's needs in equally miraculous ways. But he was doing more than just reenacting an old miracle. He was expanding it, demonstrating that God's provision had grown even more abundant. Moreover, this miracle preceded Jesus' later words, "I am the bread of life." In this act of feeding thousands, Jesus was painting a vivid picture of his mission to nourish not just bodies, but souls. He was demonstrating that he is the source of true satisfaction, the one who can meet our deepest needs. The disciples, who had doubted at first, now found themselves overwhelmed by excess. They had seen Jesus heal the sick and cast out demons, but this miracle touched everyone present in a deeply personal way. It wasn't just a display of power, it was a demonstration of care, of abundance. of a love that meets people's needs in practical, sensible ways. But there is one more twist that will blow your mind. Do you know how many people were really fed by Jesus? Here's a shocking truth that often gets overlooked. Remember when we said Jesus fed 5,000, but was there anyone who was left? In ancient Jewish society, it was common for men to travel with their families. If we assume that many of the men present had brought their wives and an average of 2 to 3 children each, the total number could easily have been 3 or 4 times the 5,000 men counted. In the cultural context of the time, it was common to count only the men present. But we know that women and children were there too, increasing the crowd to numbers far beyond the 5,000 often cited. Think about it. The Gospel of Matthew tells us the number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. This means the actual number of people fed could have been 10,000, 15,000, or even more. That means Jesus might have fed 15,000 to 20,000 people that day. Some scholars even suggest the number could have been as high as 30,000. It was not just a hillside, but an entire stadium's worth of people, all experiencing this miraculous provision together. Every person fed, every hungry mouth satisfied, not just the men, but the women who followed Jesus, the children who sat at his feet. Entire families and communities experienced this miracle together. If the numbers are so much bigger than we thought, what does this tell us about the nature of God's provision? It speaks to a generosity that goes beyond our human categories and limitations, a love that doesn't discriminate or leave anyone out. Now, you would be wondering, how many women and children did Jesus feed? And what was the total number of people that experienced this miracle? The truth is, no one went hungry that day. Not the 5,000 men counted. Not the women and children overlooked in the tally, not even that hypothetical 5,000 first person. Because in God's economy of grace, there is always more than enough. But wait, the miracles don't stop here. If you thought the feeding of thousands was mind-blowing, you haven't seen anything yet. Ever wondered how Noah managed to fit 2 of every animal on a single boat? A massive vessel, longer than a football field, and as tall as a 4-story building. But that's just the beginning. Inside this floating marvel, multiple decks housed animals beyond imagination. How did Noah and his family keep thousands of creatures fed and healthy for months on end? What ingenious systems did they devise to manage waste and prevent disease? And just how did a handful of family members maintain this incredible ark? Click here on this video to uncover the mind-boggling logistics behind the most famous ship in history. Noah's Ark is bigger, more complex, and far more fascinating than you ever imagined.